All right, let's dive into this speech, shall we? It's given by a prominent economist, someone who spent decades advising governments and world leaders, especially in Eastern Europe, I hear. And, well, let's just say he has some pretty strong opinions about the whole situation over there and the events that, led up to it.
Yeah, what really struck me about this speech, is that it's not just some ivory tower academic spouting theories. This guy has been deeply involved in Eastern European affairs for over 36 years, advising governments in Poland, Russia, Ukraine, you name it, all over that whole former Soviet bloc. I mean, think about it. He was even personally involved with Gorbachev and Yeltsin, right there in the thick of things after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Wow, so this is somebody who really has seen history unfold firsthand, not just read about it in a book.
Exactly. And that firsthand experience, it really shapes his whole perspective, For example, he argues that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S., they sort of adopted this, what he calls a unipolar worldview. Like they thought, all right, we're the only superpower left, so we get to call all the shots.
So that's where this whole NATO expansion thing comes in, right? I mean, I always thought NATO expanded to, protect those former Soviet states. But he's saying there's more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. He claims the U.S. basically pushed NATO eastward, aggressively, which totally contradicted what they had promised Russia. And it just fueled this deep anxiety in Moscow. He really sees this expansion as a fundamental driver of all the tensions we're seeing play out today.
That's a pretty bold statement. But hold on, he doesn't just stop at NATO, does he? He also seems to connect this pattern to other conflicts all over the world, right?
Yeah, he links those interventions, like Iraq, Syria, Libya. He argues they're all part of this bigger pattern of U.S.-led interventionism. And he's pretty convinced that Europe, in their close alliance with the U.S., has really paid a hefty price. They've basically surrendered their own independent voice when it comes to foreign policy.
And then he gets even more specific, right? He points to that 2008 Bucharest summit as this pivotal moment. That's where the U.S. really pushed for NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, even though Russia was like, hey, this is a red line.
Yeah, and he even tells this story about meeting with Georgia's president back then, Mikhail Saakashvili, right before that 2008 war with Russia. He describes Saakashvili as super hawkish, like he was practically itching for a fight. And he kind of suggests that the U.S. was actively encouraging this aggressive stance.
Wait a minute. So he's not just saying the U.S. expanded NATO. He's actually suggesting they were encouraging actions that could provoke Russia. I mean, that's a pretty serious claim.
Oh, he goes even further. He claims the U.S. was actually involved in trying to overthrow the Ukrainian president in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, because, he was leaning toward closer ties with Russia.
And he brings up that leaked phone call, right, between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Sachs. As evidence of the U.S. meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs. It's pretty hard to ignore what they were saying in that conversation.
Exactly. And he's also super critical of how the U.S. handled those Minsk agreements, the ones that were supposed to bring peace to eastern Ukraine after 2014. He argues that the U.S. basically undermined those agreements, sabotaged any chance for a peaceful resolution.
So basically what we're hearing is this pretty scathing critique of U.S. foreign policy. He's saying the U.S. has consistently put their own interests ahead of global stability, and they've shown very little regard for Russia's security concerns.
Yeah, he seems to think this whole approach has been a major blunder, leading to way more instability, and pushing the world closer to the brink. And he paints a pretty disturbing picture when it comes to, the consequences of all this, especially when it comes to nuclear security. This guy, he's deeply concerned about the dismantling of those nuclear arms control treaties and, the U.S. deploying all those missile defense systems in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I can see why he'd be worried about that. I mean, those treaties that they were put in place to prevent, a total catastrophic escalation, right?
Exactly. And he argues that all of these actions, plus this whole disregard for Russia's security concerns, it's just significantly increased the risk of nuclear conflict.
Okay, so let's talk about 2022 for a minute. I mean, we know he's pretty critical of the U.S. and NATO, but what does he actually say about what Russia did? And about Putin's motivations.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. He basically argues that Putin's main goal was to make sure Ukraine stayed neutral, and to prevent NATO from expanding any further. He thinks Putin saw this as an existential threat to Russia's security, like a red line they absolutely could not cross.
But come on, there had to be other ways for Russia to address those concerns.
Right.
I mean, short of a full-blown invasion.
Well, he actually says that in a negotiated settlement, it was totally possible in those early days of the conflict. He even claims he was personally involved in some back-channel negotiations and that things were actually looking kind of promising. But then he says the U.S. and the U.K., they just shut the whole thing down.
Hold on, he's saying they deliberately blocked a peaceful resolution. That's a big accusation.
He is. And he thinks it just shows how, domestic politics, it often overrides strategic thinking when it comes to international relations. He even suggests that, Trump, for all his, unpredictability, might be the one to actually break this deadlock.
Whoa, wait. He thinks Trump is the key to ending the conflict.
That's his reasoning, yeah. He thinks that Trump, because he doesn't want to look weak and he wants to leave a legacy and all that, would be more willing to negotiate a quick end to the fighting. But he also stresses that Europe shouldn't just sit around waiting for the U.S. to, change their mind. He wants a more assertive Europe, a more independent Europe, one that puts their own interests first and actively pursues a peaceful resolution, even if it means going against the U.S.
So basically, he's calling for Europe to totally overhaul their foreign policy, to break away from this traditional reliance on the U.S.
Pretty much. He sees Europe as this, mediator, a bridge builder between Russia and the West, a Europe that, recognizes Russia's legitimate security concerns, but also upholds Ukraine's sovereignty.
I mean, it's a bold vision, no doubt. But is it realistic? I mean, given everything that's going on, can we really imagine a situation where Russia and the West actually manage to, coexist peacefully?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He acknowledges that there's deep mistrust on both sides, and he doesn't try to, downplay the challenges or pretend there are easy answers.
But even so, he seems to think that history offers some glimmers of hope. I mean, we've seen former enemies reconcile and actually build a lasting peace, right?
He does, and he says it requires, being willing to talk to each other, even with people we totally disagree with, recognizing that we have some shared interests and committing to finding common ground.
And he has some pretty strong words for certain European countries, too, especially the Baltic states, right?
Yeah.
He basically tells them to, tone down the anti-Russian rhetoric and focus on building bridges, not burning them.
Yeah, he seems particularly worried about the Baltic states, because they're right next door to Russia and they have this history of tension. He thinks they'd be much better off taking a less confrontational approach.
Yeah.
And trying to find ways to, coexist peacefully with their big, powerful neighbor.
It's really amazing how he manages to weave together all this historical analysis.
Yeah.
And geopolitical insights and personal anecdotes to create this, super compelling and thought-provoking narrative.
Yeah, he obviously knows the region inside and out. And he's not afraid to, challenge conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
Or offer solutions that are a little bit outside the box.
I got to say, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to some perspectives I hadn't really considered before.
Same here. He raises so many important questions about, the nature of power and the role of ideology and the future of Europe in this world that's constantly changing.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? He wants us to look beyond those, those simplistic narratives we always get fed, to look past the headlines and really dig deeper.
That's what I appreciate about his analysis. He doesn't shy away from the messy stuff, the complicated bits. No easy answers here. And he doesn't let Europe off the hook either, even though his critique of U.S. foreign policy is pretty harsh.
He seems to be saying that Europe, they need to stop being a passenger in the back seat. It's time for them to take the wheel and, start driving their own destiny, so to speak.
Exactly. He wants a Europe that's not just, following America's lead all the time, but a Europe that's a force for peace and stability in its own right. A Europe that can actually engage with Russia, not out of fear, but with a clear understanding of what's at stake, both the risks and the potential benefits.
So it's like he's advocating for this more pragmatic approach, right? One that says, okay, Russia has some legitimate security concerns. We get it. But we also need to uphold international law and, the sovereignty of countries like Ukraine's.
Exactly. And I think this is where his personal experience really comes into play. This isn't just some academic talking. He's been there. He's seen the consequences of conflict, the difficulty of achieving peace firsthand.
He's reminding us that peace doesn't just happen magically, right? It takes constant effort, dialogue, compromise, and it takes recognizing our shared humanity. even when we disagree, even when things get really tough.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, he's also pushing us to think critically about the information that's out there, to question those dominant narratives, to look for different perspectives. It's so easy to get swept up in the emotions, the propaganda, especially when there is a crisis going on.
This deep dive has really been quite a journey, hasn't it? From the collapse of the Soviet Union all the way to what's happening in Ukraine today. We've explored the history, the geopolitics, how individual actions can have such a huge impact.
And it's made us consider other points of view, to rethink what we thought we knew, and face some pretty tough questions, to be honest.
So as we wrap things up here, I want to ask you, the listener, what are you taking away from all of this? What stuck with you? What questions are still swirling around in your head?
I hope this conversation has piqued your interest, made you want to learn more.
Because at the end of the day, it's through dialogue, understanding, and being willing to challenge our own views that we can hope to create a more peaceful world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us on this journey, exploring this really complex and, incredibly important topic.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.